Good morning. My name is Jim Conyers. I am the director of the African American Studies program and also University Professor of African American Studies here at the University of Houston. My topic of discussion today will be on Africana culture, primarily looking at the African diaspora. First of all, we need to have a couple of definitions to provide clarity and context for the discussion, in which I'll bridge from working in discussion on the Africana diaspora and then moving into looking at Africana cosmology, ethos, and rap, a social study of black popular culture. Quickly, culture can be defined in four general basic areas. And this is a survey approach. One is history. And history can be defined as the record of human events shaped in the image and the interest of the person who's chronicling the information and recording. Second, culture can be defined by motifs. And motifs are signs and symbols that reaffirm a people based on visual aesthetics. Third, there's the issue of ethos. And ethos is another collective component of culture, whereas it addresses the issue of accountability and memory of a people over a given period of time. And so each group, each generation has to address and raise query regarding their accountability for the next generation and what will they leave forward regarding legacy. And then the fourth area of culture is mythology. Mythology is a version of historical information and myth, but therefore it has a transitional flux which identifies place, space, and time, which this means simply is this. How you look at a story in contemporary times will address where you're currently at. However, over a period of time with life experience, with reflection, with reflexivity, then one can begin to tell that story differently over a period of time. Doesn't mean that there is falsification. It just identifies that for the most part, that information can be changed based on where a person is at in their own present life experiences. And so that's mythology. When we talk about the African diaspora, we can use the term African diaspora or we can use the term Africana. Diaspora refers to primarily, which is a suffix to African, identifies the issue of dispersion. So we're talking about the dispersion of African people outside of the continent of Africa. If I was to use the term Africana, and it would be spelled high case A, F-R-I-C-A-N-A, that A at the end of African also would identify the dispersion of Africans throughout the continent. Now, another way that this could also be defined is that there are two forms of Pan-Africanism. Global Pan-Africanism and Continental Pan-Africanism. Continental Pan-Africanism refers to the unification of all African nation states on the continent of Africa. Global Pan-Africanism refers to the unification of African people throughout the global world. So what we see is that as we talk about the African diaspora, as we begin to define African or African culture or Africana culture, which could also find itself chronologically in pre-colonial and post-colonial, that there's a survey approach to identify the issue of commonality, not sameness or specificity. Now, how this relates to looking at Africana cosmology, ethos, and rap, and bridging this in is that oftentimes when we look at popular culture, we think that these are ideas and views that have no reflection or relationship to the past. Simply put, we could be referring to looking at cultural retention or cultural creations. Cultural retentions are those issues, those points, those aspects, those characteristics that come out of the past of our culture, but we don't have somewhat of a memory of it, so we don't really understand why we do it. For example, if you talked about the ring shot, if you talked about jumping the broom, if you talked about long-windedness on holding multisyllabic words. These are cultural retentions of African people, and we can perhaps identify them in East Africa, West Africa, South Africa, Central Africa. The other is that if we were to say, for example, if we were looking at cultural creations are those things that were developed here in America, which African people or African Americans have participated in, which they have created, but there is no historical or cultural linkage to showing that this came from some area of continental Africa. So when we talk about Kwanzaa, because this is the month of December, so we talk about Kwanzaa, some people say, well, Kwanzaa has always existed. Kwanzaa has not always existed. Kwanzaa is a cultural creation of African Americans. However, it borrows cultural retentions of looking at the Zawadi, which is gifts. If it looks at the Makika, which is the mat. If it looks at the issue of principles, if it looks at the issue of categorization of information. If it even looks at the whole concept of the word Kiswahili, which Kiswahili is a Bantu language, so as long as you say Ki and you say Swahili, then the Bantu language means that it is a language made up of several languages which people primarily speak in the eastern region of Africa. So it's not so much in Kenya, although it is the national language of Tanzania but it borrows from a number of different languages on the continent. So what I've attempted to give you is pretty much is a very interdisciplinary matrix of one, what is the African diaspora? 2, how do we define culture? 3, looking at global and continental Pan-Africanism. 4, identifying what is the matrix that brings a nexus between African people's worldview, their issues of accountability, and then those aspects that are in popular culture, which we say is rap music in this one. Let me proceed very quickly. Right? My study is pretty much based from looking at research that I've conducted in a book entitled African American Jazz and Rap, Black Expressive Behavior in the Diaspora. And what I wanted to do was to bring together a cohort of scholars, and we would discuss this issue about, what is, our views of the relationship between jazz and rap, and then also looking at the relationships between jazz and traditional African music in West Africa, primarily in Ghana, looking at the Akan ethnic group. And so let me just proceed and just provide more discussion on this. When we examine critically African American or Africana memory, ethos, and rap music, with emphasis on Black popular culture, Africana identifies the continuity and the relationship between African people's existence on the continent and throughout the diaspora. The memory, then, in this sense, focuses on the sacred relationship of identifying social accountability and responsibility of one generation to the next. And then, in this sense, ethos can be referred to as the sum total expression of reflexivity, meaning how do you study the moment while living in the moment, and memory, in the process to locate what I refer to as a social, ecological, and humanistic behavioral patterns. Now, before I go any further, let me stop and say this. These are open-ended ideas which do not draw towards specificity, which are not judgmental, and which are not hierarchical. Let me continue. Marimba Ani discusses the idea of ethos in the following manner. And I quote her by saying, "Our spirit symbolizes our uniqueness as a people, or we could say that the African American ethos is spiritual. The ethos of a people is related to special characteristics that identify them as a group, setting them apart from other groups. Our ethos refers to our emotional responses and our reactions. And it has to do with the way in which certain things make us feel good and how others displease us. It is the bedrock of our Black aesthetic. It has to do with things in life that excite us and those about which we share laughter. It helps us to explain why we tend to ignore some things and why other things make us cry. Ethos, like culture, is understood to refer to the shared group reaction and the shared group's responses. End of quote. Concerning the conceptual format of a social study of rap music and black popular culture, this investigation examines African Americans' functional values, interests, and shared norms. The focus attempts to provide substance and a common sense approach to mapping the ascribed phenomena, again, as I mentioned earlier, in place, space, and time. That in itself is context for us. Let's go on further. Clovis Simmons addresses the systemic pattern of institutional racism in black popular culture in the historical context by noting, quote, even though white supremacy became a tool of oppression, whites were always drawn to and fascinated by the creative ethos of African peoples. As a servant class, African Americans injected their creative expression directly into the consciousness of the white ruling elites. The minstrel tradition, with its pejorative and grotesque images, was both an attempt by whites to copy blacks' creative expression and to preserve white supremacy. The so-called coon songs of the late 19th century achieved commercial success, or was also meant to denigrate black men, but it was clear that the black-inspired musical form could capture white markets. And as well, ragtime was a profound stimulus to the commercial sales of sheet music, and later blues and jazz had a similar effect on the sales of phonographic records. Talented black performers were associated with the recorded music industry from the inception of the industry, but whites gained greater success through performing black music. The fascination for black life continued, but the formula by which white audiences could experience their version of black culture through white performers became a lucrative one. End of quote. In a historical overview, and also in a semantical context, the term artist is used to performers and writers within the rap industry. For historical purposes, the first rap records recorded were King Tim 3 and The Rapper's Delight by the Sugar Hill Gang. Although rap and hip-hop emerged in the South Bronx in 1976, the first records weren't recorded until around 1979. Trisha Rose discusses the historical foundation and preposition of rap music by saying the following, quote, rap music's sonic forces are very much an outgrowth of black cultural traditions, the post-industrialist information of urban life, and the contemporary technological terrain, end of quote. On a similar note, Robin D.G. Kelly writes, excuse me for a minute, that, quote, lest we get to sociological, let's not get too sociological here, Kelly writes, we must bear in mind that the hip-hop, irrespective of its particular flavor, is music. Few doubt it has a message, whether they interpret it as a straight-up nihilism or the words of primitive rebels. Not many pay attention to rap as an art, whether the rappers are mixing break beats from the Funkadelics, gangsta limping, in black bodies, and appropriating old school hustlers' toast, or simply trying to be funny, end of quote. To illustrate this point further, I'd like to give a list of, more or less a chronological list, looking at Africa Bambaata's hypography of different issues, times, places, and events that have occurred as we look at rap music. And again, keeping this in mind, looking at retention of Africana culture. In 1969, Kool Herc, who is a DJ, moves to the Bronx from Jamaica, and he introduces the fusion between reggae, party music, and mixing. By 1974, African Bambaataa coins the term hip-hop and advances mixing with different genres of party music. By 75, Kool Herc, unfortunately, is injured in a party, and his career goes into a decline. By 1976, Grandmaster Flash introduces quick mixing and the whole concept of storybook rap with the group The Furious 3. By 78, Grand Wizard Theodore introduces scratching to mixing. By 79, the Sugar Hill Gang releases their notable piece, The Rapper's Delight, which becomes the first rap hit single. By 1980, Curtis Blow has a hit, These Are the Breaks, and he becomes the first rap gold single. By 1982, Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five released The Message, and this was a very interesting rap dialogue, and it was a foundation for the development of what we refer to as teacher-conscious rap music. By 1984, Roxanne Shante releases her first insult rap entitled Roxanne's Revenge. By 1985, Dougie Fresh and Slick Rick released their first hit singles, The Show and Lottie Dottie. By 1985, LL Cool J releases his hit single Radio, and he introduces the first elements of gangster rap. By 1987, Eric B. and Rakim released their hit single, I Know You Got Soul, which uses a lot of sampling from James Brown. By 1988, Public Enemy revives message-conscious rap music with their hit single, Rebel Without a Cause. By 1988, NWA creates what was referred to as this obscene West Coast gangster rap with the hit single, and I won't say A is A, so we can't even use that on film. And then by 1988, Tone Loc's hit single, The Wild Thing, becomes one of the best-selling rap singles, so it's a fusion between rap and pop music. This social study analysis of black popular culture seeks to illustrate patterns of reflexivity of music antecedent to rap in the form of bebop jazz, and what I coined as Afrocentric folk music, i.e. the rhythm and blues fused with jazz. And this is kind of looking at like Gil Scott-Heron and some others. When the term Afrocentric folk music is used, it refers to a combination of jazz, rhythm and blues, rap, scatting, and soul music collectively. And the central lyrics and spirit of music reflect and speak to the cultural imperatives of everyday life experiences of African Americans. Howard Cruz, in his Crisis of the Negro Intellectual, explores and describes these issues with critical analysis and perceptiveness as he writes the following. Afro-American folk music became an aesthetic ingredient, that cultural material, the wealth exploited by white American cultural imperialism. This kind of appropriation can be explained only by an analysis of cultural apparatus in its all economic, class, political, and institutional ramifications. Without it, one cannot explain how or why an Ellington does not achieve his due recognition today, or while Gershwin-type musicians achieved status and recognition in the 1920s for music that they literally stole from the Harlem nightclubs. The impact of Negro jazz was powerful enough to arouse the concern of white critics about the idiomatic direction of American music. But it was a concern like Seldes could not afford to extend to its logical conclusion. The critics would talk all around the questions while evading it, as Seldes did when he wrote of the music itself and of jazz and the use of spirituals and the whole question of our national music. This is not the place to write. End of quote. Patricia Liggins Collins' anthology on African American culture and the notes of relationship between rap, jazz, and Afrocentric folk music are the following. Quote, although rap has evolved into a highly technological form, it is unmistakably rooted in African American tradition. According to essayist Gerald Early in Politics and the Black American Song, the music is an offshoot of black masculine toast, the revolutionary poetry of Gil Scott-Heron, and the last poet in the American soul funk music, end of quote. Even more important, the conflict or statement of the problem addressed in this study raises the following query. 1. Who defines the limitations of what is a black artist? 2. What are the ramifications and accountability of artists versus detached labor regulators. And 3, what are the challenges that confront the creativity and humanistic aspects of black artists? Again, the problem addressed in this study circumvents the dialectics of individualism and seeks to foster a communalistic approach regarding African Americans' quest to seek alternatives for social, political, and economic advancement. Addison Gale describes the essential function and representation of the African American critic as the following. Quote, the elevation of the black critic and black criticism into acceptance and respectability to the black community is a major achievement for the job of the critic. Or as Tony K. Bombara writes, to call a halt to madness and is primarily the critics of the black aesthetic persuasion who have attempted to fulfill this function. They have called a halt to the madness of the 1940s and 50s that propounded the idea that literature could serve as a catharsis for whites, that it might produce changes in them that would force them to move towards producing the great society, end of quote. Although a broad gamut of information has been addressed pertaining to memory, ethos, and rap music, this essay will present the following thematic approaches to the topic. 1, rationale of a step. 2, organizational structure. 3, meaning and purpose of ethos in rap music. 4, rap, reflexivity on jazz. 5, intellectual history of teacher rap music. And 6, a conclusion in which I attempt to offer alternatives and analysis of the subject at hand. Let me start with rationale. As African Americans approach the 21st century, institutional and individual racism continues to hamper black progress in American society. And unfortunately, society's denial of racialism leads to the perception that racism somehow operates in an isolated manner. Primarily on a micro and macro level of analysis. Barbara Shade identifies some of these problems of behavior and socialization with the influence of television and radio. And she writes, in her study of the world of lower-class urban black youth, Keller in 1963 found that television was a persistent influence. In fact, it appears that for many low-income youth, contact with television is more frequent and more sustained than with other socializing agents. Other research suggests that many youth within the African American community watch television and listen to the radio, and more than the average person in our society. And this is looking at Greenberg, 1972. The frequency and intensity of contact suggests that television might be an important socializing agent for African American children and youth, end of quote. Craig Brookins and Tracy Robinson offer an alternative epistemological framework to describe and evaluate African American youth also, still within rationale. And they said, quote, the second view holds that the psychological experiences of African Americans youth are either disordered or disadvantaged. And far too often, African American youth are disproportionately represented in the statistics on adolescence, pregnancy, substance abuse, and violent crime as both victims and perpetrators. End of quote. Let me continue. Robbie Staples and Terry Jones add on their analysis by saying human society has been characterized throughout history by unequal access to its values. The inequity is often accepted by the dozens as the natural order of life. And as such, since the inequality enhances a small group, the minority are at the expense of the masses. And then it is necessary to erect some kind of cultural apparatus which serves as the function of convincing the exploited groups that this unequitable condition is necessary and natural, end of quote. Paradoxically, the results of repeated behavioral patterns of black subordination and oppression are the results of neglected historical and cultural experiences of African Americans over the past century. On the other hand, the consistent agitation of assimilationist theories, labeling, scapegoating, and racial ethnic genocide are the consequences of the systemic creation of subordinate group status and the emergence of a black xenocentric perspective. Overall, these forces generate a common mindset of self-alienation and negativity. Furthermore, the dialogue and literature on these subjects are continually dismiss the idea that African Americans have a national culture and simultaneously participate in popular culture, as do Americans from across all other ethnic groups or racial groups. More precisely, national ethnic culture of African Americans is extremely difficult to trace because of the systemic process of involuntary migration. Although geographic boundaries, historical chronologies, language patterns, and mythologies are conceptual approaches that have been used in the past to study and identify linkages of cultures and kinship of African Americans. And of course, the relevant point addressed here is that in order to study and attempt to develop a conceptual understanding of any group, but primarily our emphasis on African Americans and African American culture and history, one must first engage in an analysis of continental African or Caribbean African culture. Let's look at the structure of what we're attempting to explain here. The organization of this study takes the form of a social examination of black popular culture. And of course, when examining the parameters of African or Africana phenomena, multiple articulations of racialism, social stratification of class, and gender issues must be discussed within the context of the historical and cultural experiences of African Americans. When referring to a social study, the data retrieved lends support to the need to examine secondary source data, with an emphasis on the Africana ethos in its reflection in the genre of teacher rap conscious music. Therefore, the methodology of this study focuses on a qualitative assessment of the aforementioned topics, seeking to offer alternatives to differentiate between artistry and what are characterized as, I refer to as, detached labor regulators in the field of rap music, and more precisely within the genre of teacher rap conscious music. The design employed in providing this analysis leans a lot on secondary sources, borrowing some tools of analysis from semiotics and kinesics. Semiotics is the study, again, of looking at signs and symbols. Kinesics is the study of nonverbal communication. Furthermore, although the general methodological approach is to focus on the use of one research design, what I'm attempting to do in this discussion is to use a holistic application of qualitative research designs, and it allows me to probe with breadth and depth in the attempt to describe and evaluate black artistry and the humanistic contribution to this advancement in the development of African American people in the 21st century. In a short-term piece, what we're doing is we're participating in triangulation and then also in what is referred to as meta-theory. Ethos, in the sense, as we come to it, as mentioned earlier, it begins studying African Americans' culture, and we must examine continental African history, at least in a survey manner. This comes back to the very beginning of what we discussed with the African diaspora. It becomes challenging to try to study African diasporic history without studying any aspect of continental African history, even in a survey manner. And critical to this perspective is that African Americans have consistently been positioned to write themselves into history. This applies, for example, to the issue of African Americans being forced to petition the fact that they are human. And from this point, the investigative queries seek to explain and enumerate the repeated behavior pattern of exploited masses of humans by other humans in the name and sake of humanity, meaning that what right does one group of humans have to exploit another group of humans, only to identify that perhaps they're more human, and that is not justifiable. Therefore, the cultural and historical foundations of African, Caribbean, in American history are found in Africa. And paradoxically, there are numerous problems to trying to study history of the entire continent. Nevertheless, regional and geographical studies have been informative in studying culture and kinship of indigenous peoples on the continent of Africa. Still, these points are relative to the central thematic focus of the recollection of ethos and memory. And cultural foundations provide maps and signposts for the recollection of, again, ethos and memory. There's been a lot of discussion at this point, and I want to come back to what was addressed earlier as we wrap up with our conversation on the African diaspora. And the discussion, what I attempted to do in this short essay, is to provide an interpretive analysis of ethos and rap music from what I would refer to as a deep structural or Afrocentric perspective. And this brings to the point the exploitive structure within the rap music industry is not a new phenomenon. This has occurred with other Africans and R&B and blues being exploited regarding fiscal, budgetary, legacy, and also even with copyrights of work as well. But in looking at this and knowing that it's not a new phenomenon, it's one that has its roots in historical precedents within the institutionalization of neocolonialism and capitalism, and also we can say racialism, and all couched within what one could identify as a Eurocentric hegemonic perspective. Gwendolyn Gilbert offers the following perspective on neocolonialism, just to provide a definition of this term, by saying the following. Neocolonialism in America can simply be described as the condition wherein the oppressed blacks have equal constitutional rights and all of the outward trappings of democracy. The reality is that the system of capitalism exploits the black community. It keeps it politically powerless, and it maintains this relationship most obviously through a system of institutionalized racism. Also augmenting these points on the issue of racialism is S.E. Anderson, and he prescribes the problems and limitations of black intellectuals' articulation and analysis of capitalism in the following. And he says, notwithstanding or struggling with the nature of domestic American racism and capitalism, we are domestically colonized people. This reality is by no means an accident. Our colonial status is a systemic part of white American racism and capitalism. And the social political factors of American racism need and oppress people not only to justify its superiority, but its complex, and the political economic factors of capitalism need and oppress people to super exploit terms in looking at labor and consumption. End of quote. Let's go very quickly to foundations of rap and reflexivity. Congruent to this investigation on rap and black popular music, reflexivity serves as a tool of analysis which provides a conjunction for theory and method. Rosanna Hertz defines reflexivity as the following. Reflexivity implies a shift in our understanding of data in this collection. It's something that's accomplished through detachment, internal dialogue, and constant and intensive scrutiny of what I know and how I know it. To be reflexive is to have an ongoing conversation about experience while simultaneously living in the moment. End of quote. Reflexivity then is ubiquitous. It permeates every aspect of research process. It challenges us to become more full conscious of ideology, culture, and politics, and of those we study and those we select as our audience. And in looking at the genre of teacher rap music, and it has been or can be referred to as hip-hop, and hip-hop in many ways gives direction to a cultural fabric, synthesis, and context to locating meaning and context within of its lyrics and of its beats. On the other hand, concerning the substantial value and structure of jazz, Wynton Marsalis says, quote, to great music. A lot went into making of it. It's made to be strong and durable. There were many great musicians who played it and recorded it, and that the articulating standard of it is still very high. It will and always will be a challenge for younger musicians to play it. And when it is played properly, the audiences love it. End of quote. In addition, T.S. Monk attributes the versatility and the continued existence of jazz by saying the following, quote, because it continues to renew itself, any art form that pushes the envelope is likely to persist, end of quote. Equally important, John Baskerville writes, quote, black music, like any other form of the African American experience, is a reflection of African American life during any given period of time. The work and song, or songs of the field, hollers reflected the condition of slavery or enslavement. The Jubilee spirituals reflected the optimism of Reconstruction, whereas the blues reflected the uncertainty of post-Reconstruction and the Depression. And during the 1960s, a different form of music had developed that would reflect the time that it was beginning of the Black Power and the Black Arts Movement, a style of music that was referred to as free jazz, end quote. Etymology is a core component of rap culture and black culture as well. Within the hip-hop industry, the terms hip-hop and rap culture are sometimes used interchangeably. However, at best, the shift and transition in terms illustrate different phases of popular culture, of this popular culture form, should I say. Kool Herc notes that African Bambaataa coined the term hip-hop, while Herc himself used b-boy. Because of Bambaataa's nationalistic or his cultural nationalistic views, it could be interpreted that the hip-hop was a fusion of black traditional and popular culture with emphasis on a call and response to the beats and rhythms of music. William Eric Perkins supports this proposition by noting, quote, African Bambaataa, one of rap music's founders, alludes to several important roots of rap music itself. And without a doubt, the African American elements are part of rap's foundation, end of quote. Writing on the African element in the African American vernacular culture, linguist David Dalby noted in 1972 that, quote, it is at the level of an interpersonal relationship and expressive behavior that the Black American proletariat has preserved a large part of its African character. And in this sense, therefore, we should expect the survival of African linguistic features, referring to the continuation of rap music. Let me move on, and because I have a diagram which cannot be illustrated here in a video dialogue, but I'll wrap up with some narrative discussion and conclusion. Okay. All right. What I attempted to draw upon earlier and at the close of this discussion has been to address these thematic areas of memory, cosmology, ethos, and culture of rap music, and primarily looking at black popular culture. And some of the diagrams in which I'll have handouts for and I will share with the learning circle, looking at methodology and meta theory have been used as more or less procedure, and human agency have been extrapolated to discuss the issues from a scientific manner. An Afrocentric perspective was necessary in this study to examine black culture from a black prism or perspective. And a Pan-Africanist lens, global Pan-African lens, allows us to define beauty of a black aesthetic in an alternative context. On the other hand, Julius Lester writes about this, about the Eurocentric hegemonic perspective in the following. And as we close, he says, Yet while whites were denigrating black culture, they were stealing it. While saying that blacks had no culture, of Boss on the Plantation didn't have a bill, where John didn't fiddle and Sam picked the banjo. Some slaves were professional musicians who did nothing but make music when they were asked to. When others loved to go to black churches, they listened to their music. And they heard jazz in New Orleans, and they tried to imitate it, and they couldn't. They recorded it. They got money for it. And they had called these practices legitimate. This process is never abated over looking at someone like a King Oliver or Paul Whiteman or the contemporary band leaders, but who earned money on looking at African artistry. And the musical contribution of black people is recognized today, but again, looking at jazz, it is the only indigenous music for African Americans in America that has, and now that we play it, we must identify that it has an African retention to it. As I wrap up, and again, my conclusion is that as we look at the African diaspora, and as we talk about, looking at the young and middle-aged African Americans who participated in what we looked at, this notion of this rap genre, are used as sometimes political, cultural, and social surrogates of black xenocentrism. And equally important then is that artistry attempts to transcend the human consciousness to a higher level of awareness. Simultaneously, if we're moving away from artistry, one can look at, this detached labor regulating functionality and a market culture producing imagery, fiction, and derelictic aesthetics of mass popular culture. Although it appears that analysis is somewhat judgmental, it's not. And at best, it is a critical assessment differentiating between physical blackness and black spirituality and consciousness. The latter demonstrating commitment on a daily basis to addressing issues and schema of race, gender, and class. And still, artistry must be used as a tool and manifestation of rhetoric, literature, and poetic expression. Lastly, black music's intellectual history has a tradition of teaching or reaching the higher ground. In this sense, the higher ground is a refuge that enables the advancement and transcendence that characterizes upliftment of a race. Let not young artists or detached labor regulators lose memory of the struggle and the fight for black autonomy, kinship, and culture. And as African Americans envision moving into a new millennium, the challenges, adversity, and their perspectives will be repeatedly confronted within a market culture. Perhaps memory, culture, and cosmology can be utilized in teach rap conscious music and also in technology in the attempt to produce music with meaning and purpose and for the advancement of African Americans. Nzuri sana, tutananana.